All right, hello travelers. Welcome to Reach the World STEM Week. For over 20 years, Reach the World has inspired youth to become curious, confident, and compassionate global citizens using virtual exchange. My name is Brianna Rowe, and as part of Reach's effort to support educators and families during the COVID-19 pandemic, we are sharing free live stream events with members of our global community. You can find a complete listing of upcoming events and much more on our website, athome.reachtheworld.org. Now today, we're welcoming Matthias Breiter. Matthias has spent more than 3 decades studying black, brown, grizzly, and polar bears. He's an award-winning author and renowned wildlife photographer, and he's traveled the world to observe and document bears in their natural habitat. Have you ever wondered what it's like to walk among polar bears? You're about to find out. Now to our live stream viewers, please be sure to let us know you're here by posting in the chat and share any questions using the YouTube chat bar. We'll get to as many as we can. But without further delay, I want to turn it over to our special guest. Welcome Matthias, who is calling in from Northern Canada using satellite phone. So we're gonna hope that there's no delay here. So welcome.
Hello, how are you, Brianna?
Doing great.
So just some background information about me. Well, I have an accent, grew up in Europe, but I've been living in Canada and the US for most of my life, just could never get rid of the accent. I'm a biologist by training, went to grad school in the United States, then worked as a bear biologist in Montana and then Alaska. And then about 25 years ago, started to work in Northern Canada on polar bears. And so I did my PhD work on infanticide, but my interest very quickly grew more towards behavioral studies. So I wanted to learn how bears really interact and became then more like an independent scientist, because in the research community, behavioral studies are not usually funded very well or not at all, as it's all about reproducible data, and behavioral studies has very often not reproducible data. And I always compare it to like what I wanted to know about bears. I wanted to know more than what you can get from a radio color or from doing skin samples or getting like some kind of genetic information. I see it a little bit like how much would we really know people if we put a radio color on them, but never really watch them behaving, interacting with each other. How well do we know anything if we just go by getting some scientific data that does not include behavioral data? And the only way to really get behavioral data was to actually walk among them, because early on, everything was done from the distance. You would often not really see fine detail. A lot was done from vehicles. And a lot of misconceptions came from them. Like to this day, most people believe that polar bears will hunt people. And that really isn't the case. I mean, you get accidents, but it's a little bit like assuming all people are killers because you have a murderer. There's very, very few that are really bears that are highly aggressive. So Brianna, do you want me to do a little bit about bears and like biology, the background, and before going into like walking among them?
Yeah, I think we'd love to see some of
like
the photos that you have taken, just to get a look at what we're really talking about here.
Well, I'll have a presentation prepared, and so it has obviously some images in it. And here we go, hopefully. So, are you getting those? Is that up with you?
Yep, we can see that.
The polar bears, the polar bear image? Okay, okay. So, when I started working with bears, like to understand bears, one is like to understand what is a bear. And bears are carnivores. even though they don't typically live as carnivores. Like carnivores typically, like you take cats, you take dogs, they live between famine and feast. If they catch something, they have a feast. If they don't catch anything, it's a famine. And bears pretty soon moved away from this typical carnivore concept by basically utilizing a food source that is in abundance very, very heavily, putting on a lot of weight, putting on fat reserves, and then live for the remainder of the year of that fat reserves. And that had some changes. It had changes in structure, in physical structure, like their molars are wider than in typical carnivores, their intestines are longer. Bears have been around for a long, long time. They've been successful at it. Like the first bear as a species is probably 30 million years ago. Pandas split off about 20 million years ago. For the longest time, the Tremarctinae would have been the most dominant bear group. There were at least 23 Tremarctinae species in the Americas. And about 5 million years ago, the Ursini, which is most of the present bears, split off. And it includes the polar bear. And the polar bear evolved around 1 million years ago in Siberia. It was an isolated brown bear population. And they started to specialize on hunting mammals, marine mammals on the sea ice. And it is not quite known how long ago they split off, simply by the fact that polar bears and brown bears to this day can interbreed and can have offspring. And you hear that in the news every so often that happens. It has always happened, but that makes it difficult to assess how long actually polar bears have been their own species. And this here is a skull of a polar bear I found some years ago on a little island in Hudson Bay. And it was an old animal, it was an old male that is like early 20s. So the bears usually, males don't get much beyond 20. And that bear, like you always see bears as the prime predators, the king of the Arctic. That bear had a huge injury on his hip. He broke his hip at some point, and but he must have lived with this broken hip for 2-3 years, because you could see how the bones mended. And I mean, that was a serious injury, and he lived with it for years. It must have been excruciating pain. But anyway, so I found this skull, and you can see, like, it's a typical carnivore. It has the carnassial, so the meat-slicing teeth, the P4M1. So that's the first, these, well, I can't point on it. Maybe here I can put the pointer. No. Behind the canines, you see the two teeth, one in the upper jaw, lower jaw, that kind of end up right on top of each other. These are the carnassials. That's where carnivores slice off the meat. And so this is a polar bear skull. There's a polar bear skull that is very easily recognizable as a polar bear by the enlarged nasal cavities, which is really important in polar bears. All Arctic animals basically have that. And it's a heat exchange chamber. So when we go in the Arctic, what we usually forget is drinking, because we lose a lot of water through breathing. In 40 below, we have to drink about 1 gallon of water a day just to replace the water that we lose through breathing. And for wildlife, this is a big problem. We see Arctic as, oh, well, in the winter, there's snow, so there's theoretically water available. The problem is that you actually have to melt it, and that costs a lot of energy. Like in a human, if we eat snow, we actually lose water. We have to use up we dehydrate eating snow. We have to get so much energy invested to melt the snow, and the energy that we use actually uses up water, that we end up with a negative result. We actually lose more water eating snow than we gain it. In a polar bear, that wouldn't be the case, but there's a lot of energy wasted. And so if you can prevent losing water, it makes a big difference in the Arctic. Polar bears are all about energy conservation. And so the polar bear that you watch in the Arctic walking, he will, breathing in and out through the nose, you won't see a plume in front of the nose. They don't lose water through the nose, because it heats up the air that you inhale, and it cools down the air as you exhale, which also then impacts how they hunt. Like polar bears will not actively hunt much. They will do ambush hunting. They will sit and wait. And that's a lot about energy consumption. So what do polar bears eat? You all hear they're marine mammal hunters, but they also eat a lot of other stuff. Like the first time I was there, I saw them scavenging like dead birds. I saw them actually eating kelp. We've watched polar bears diving down to kelp 30 feet down. There isn't much nutrition in kelp. There must be some trace elements that they need. But mostly what polar bears do, they feed on marine mammals. So polar bears are dependent on sea ice to really hunt their food sources. Most images, most places where people go and see polar bears is always when they're on land, which is truly not really their environment. They're kind of out of place. Where they live, where they gain most of their weight is out on the sea ice, and particularly when the seals are pupping, because it's marine mammals they go after and mostly seals. They will also hunt some other stuff, but that is the majority of it. And then if you look at polar bears, so the first time I did everything through a vehicle, and like just some adaptation of a polar bear, just look at the paw, how furred it is. They have actually little papilla on their pads that prevents them from slipping. Their claws are much more curved than in a grizzly. And they also see that Roman nose on the polar bear that I talked about. That's so important to them. And here's like comparison. You have a grizzly track on the right and a polar bear track on the bottom. And you see the difference. Polar bears are much rounder, wider paws. All bears walk on the soles of their feet just to support their weight. So that makes them a bit slower, but they're so much heavier. And then if you look at some other characteristics here, look at the long neck in the polar bear, and that's to enable them to swim more easily. They can breathe more easily when swimming. It's easier to keep their head above water. And polar bears are amazing swimmers. They've been seen 100 miles offshore, not being distressed at all. And we once watched a polar bear on the north end of Lancaster Sound. Lancaster Sound at the spot is about 100 miles across. And he went to the water and just swam south. And we had some friends on the south side of Lancaster Sound. They had a camp there, and they told us that he arrived the next day. So that bear just swam across the sound for 100 miles. Then there's some behavioral adaptation that actually comes with living on the ice. If you see that polar bear below, like this is a female that followed cubs on thin ice, and she fell through the ice. She was just heavier. And you see that she is spreading out her legs to pull her back onto the ice, and only moves her front legs to pull her back up. And swimming, they do actually the same thing. They swim like seals. So they actually drag their hind legs and only swim with the front legs. And that's different. It's a behavioral adaptation in brown bears. Brown bears swim like dogs. They use all four legs. Polar bears don't. They only use the front legs, and they're fast. Like if you're a kayaker, you will have trouble just staying ahead of them. So then when we see polar bears, we assume always that to some degree, what we perceive cold, they would see as cold. What we see as comfortable, we would see as comfortable. This is actually not a bear relaxing. This is a bear that is heat stressed and he tries to cool off. So even in 40 below, a healthy bear has trouble if he's active of overheating, because they can't really dissipate heat. Like we sweat, we really don't have subcutaneous fat. In bears, the fat is underneath the skin, and they really have no way of dissipating heat. And the only way they can do it is right in their groins and in their armpits. And so they lie spread eagle to expose them to the ice to get rid of heat. And brown bears do the same thing. But when I first worked with bears, so I wanted to see behavioral. Infanticide was important to me. And you would see certain behavioral thing, like this was a big male that killed a juvenile. But again, this is not typical behavior. In all these years, I've seen it twice that a bear killed another bear. And what amazed me about polar bears was that they were way more social than brown bears. You would see bears play. If there is play, there's always food. You know, if there is bears playing, there's somewhere food. And which then only until later I really realized how different polar bears behaviorally are to brown bears is when you see the picture below, what we focus on is that dog. Why is the dog interacting with these bears? And like from a bear perspective, what could be possible go wrong with interacting with a dog? But from a dog perspective, like, heck, I mean, they're totally overpowered by a polar bear. But the interesting part is too, we have 3 polar bears here. In brown bears and grizzlies, you basically don't see males interacting. And in polar bears, you actually way more social, which then also enables me to walk with them. If you have a social animal, animals also react to cues, and they are able to, they look for cues from you. And so I then started to realizing that bears are more social. I started to do what people told me couldn't be done, and that work on the ground with bears. Is before, when working with vehicles, working with like buggy operators in the Churchill area, you only see certain behavior. You don't really see the full population. You only see males. You hardly ever see females with cubs, and you hardly see any social interaction between different age groups. And you see the males hanging out, you have some juveniles hanging out, and that's about it. But then I got the opportunity to get to other places. Friends of mine owned cabins there, and then females and cubs would hang around the cabins. And I was really interested to see also behavioral differences between like grizzlies and polar bears. At the time, I had already worked for years with grizzlies and knew how they behaved around fishing streams, how they would interact. And now I wanted to see how this is for polar bears. And like there's one thing, the picture before was a female defending her cubs, but you couldn't see the cubs, they were just off the frame. This year is also a female defending her cubs. So on the right is a skinny male, left is an adult female with 2 yearling cubs. I mean, almost her size. And this is what happens in polar bears. The polar bears actually, the cubs will stay with the female. They don't run off. Like you have a grizzly getting into a fight, the cubs will run away. You have a black bear getting in the fight, the cubs will climb up a tree. In polar bears, the cubs stay right with the female. That's the safest spot to be. And then people always say you can't read bear behavior, you can't read body language. Look at the ears. Look at the ears of these polar bears, how they're, this is an aggressive interaction, how the ears are placed right next to the body. And you can read this is a very agitated bear. We go back here, ears right back to the head. And now look at here, the ears where they were playing, how they're forward. And so you can certainly assess how the mood the polar bear is in, whether it is an aggressive bear, and act accordingly when you're on the ground. Like this here is a bear that is only a few feet away, but is not aggressive. The ears are forward, it's a curious bear. So for me, then it was like, I wanted to see more polar bears' life, see behaviorally. I went out to Hudson Bay, tried to photograph them, film them hunting on Hudson Bay. This is an Inuit with a dog team I met out there. Unfortunately, the ice where we were going is really bad. Like this is what we wanted, and bears on the ice. But in southern Hudson Bay, the ice around the leads is really soft, and we sunk some snow machines, so that didn't work out. Then I started to follow more bears into the denning area. Like polar bears in general don't hibernate, but pregnant females will. That's where they have their cubs. They have to go into hibernation, otherwise the pregnancy aborts. And as in southern Hudson Bay, they actually reuse dens, because the dens are going into the soil. It's underneath tree roots. And some of these dens have been used for 300 years consistently. You actually you know where the dens are, because bears will reuse these dens. Like a female every 3rd year will go back to the same den. And as females are faithful to the area they're born, so like her cubs will use then her dens or a nearby den, and cousins, and like, it's like family units. There will be like 3-4 dens within 100 yards, and there might be all related bears. And so the cubs then are born in December, and then they're 3 months in the den by late February, early March. they start to come out. By that time, the cubs are about 20 pounds in weight. And this is about the first day these cubs have ever looked outside the den. As you see, the snow is pretty much undisturbed. There's one track going out. The female was once out. The cubs have never been outside the den. And I always wondered what the cubs were thinking if they look outside the den and there's people standing. We were quite a ways away, but still. And then the family never left the den, and we went back to our camp and came back the next morning. The den the family was gone, and we looked around and we found this day den. So a lot of females, when they come out of the den, if they're not disturbed, they will actually dig a little day den to acclimatize the cubs. And so we crawled into it. It was pretty visible. There was no bear in it. And you see the claw marks on it. So she just dug that out in an hour or so and was staying the night there with the cubs. And then she left and went out towards the sea ice because she has been basically not feeding for 9 months. She lost about half of her body weight, and she needs to go feeding to, well, keep on nursing her cubs and supply the demands of the cubs. So this is how the family looks when they head out towards the sea ice. She will rest reasonably frequently. She will try to stay out of the wind. Like when you look at them like this, the cubs are quite small, about 20 pounds, not much bigger when they're born. When they're born, they're about 2 pounds. So she has to rest every 2-3 hours. She usually tries to go across open areas quickly because there actually is predation, and predation is not so much other polar bears, quite a bit is wolves. And so she will usually rest near trees so she has something to put her back against to defend herself if wolves come. And this is a female with triplets. And if you see triplets, it's reasonably rare in polar bears, and usually triplets don't survive. I've never seen triplet yearlings. Usually one of them dies, and usually the one that sits on top is the runt. And if you look at here, the runt is the one with the injured eye. And in grizzlies, you see more often triplets. And in my opinion, it has primarily to do with the nursing. A polar bear has 4 active mammary glands, so there's 4 nipples where the cubs can nurse on. And cubs, when they get a little bit older, like right now, 20 pounds, they will need 2 nipples. The 1 mammary gland is not enough to supply them. So if you have 3 cubs, you're gonna have the little one is always gonna get kicked out or pushed away from one of the nipples, and that can get really aggressive. So it really requires a stroke of luck for 3 of them to survive. And in grizzlies, they have 6 active mammary glands, so they're triplife more often. Here's another picture of triplets, and mostly like photographing them is not too bad, as they're pretty shy, and I've only had once a polar bear sow with cubs approach me, and that was this one, and she came from a mile away, and then she walked around us, settled down right next to us. Like next to us was like 40 yards away. And then when we looked where she came from, there were 2 wolves behind her. So she tried to avoid wolves. So then my walking among bears really started to come when, after 2 years working with bears, mostly through vehicles, snow machines, etc., was that I wanted to know what they're doing in the summer. And the common perception was in the summer, they would just lie down. But yeah, Matthias, that wasn't really...
If you don't mind, I'm going to actually ask a question from one of the students. Winston in DC actually has the question, what do bears do during the summertime and what happens there?
Well, this is what I'm just getting to. So now I'm getting to the summertime. So summertime, polar bears live all over the Arctic. So summertime varies quite a bit from region to region. So in the southern Hudson Bay area, which is the most southerly population of polar bears, there is on land quite a bit of resources. If you go into other Arctic areas, there might be much less. But until about 15 years ago, the general perception was that in the summer, they would just lie down and rest and live off the fat reserves they accumulated in the winter. And like this year is a female this picture was taken in August in northern Hudson Bay on Baffin Island. And I mean, she hasn't been eating in probably a month or so. As the ice is gone, there was no food, and on land there isn't much. But they will, the perception that they just lie down is simply wrong. There is feeding going on, and a lot of it, then when I started then walking among the bears, a lot of it was not observed because one reason, nobody was there. A lot of the area is very inaccessible. And then a lot of stuff was always done through boats or vehicles, and the bears simply go away, hunker down, avoid you, and it wasn't really observed. So what I tried to figure out when I went up in the summers is what they were actually doing, one, and how could I see what they were doing. I tried to cover the coastline, and part of it was that I also realized that when I was hiking around like southern Hudson Bay, I would find all these old tent rings of Inuit people, and it made me realize where they were camping there the entire time. So how, and for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and how did they survive if grizzlies or polar bears were all that aggressive? So it must be possible to walk. And so I started walking among them, and I was looking what they could actually be feeding on. Like theoretically, they could feed on walrus. Walrus are pretty tough to catch. It's simply like I've seen polar bear being attached to a walrus, like grabbing onto the neck, and the walrus would just walk into the ocean and swim off. The only chance they really have to get a walrus if they can stampede a group and then a walrus get crushed. Other food sources in the area, theoretically, would be caribou. But caribou calves, grizzlies prey on them heavily, but at the time when the calves are vulnerable, the polar bears are still on the ice. I've never watched them eat siksik, which grizzlies heavily eat, probably because there is no real food source. The siksik dig into these rocky terrain where the polar bears can't get them out. They have been watched eating eggs, but mostly the eggs are hatched by the time polar bear gets to land. But in northern, like Lancaster Sound areas, there are seabird colonies where bears have been watched in the cliffs going for eggs and young. And so when I started walking among them, like we tried it first with vehicles, and the bears would all take off. I mean, they would just run to the water. I mean, you feel pretty powerful and you feel pretty guilty at the same time when you have these big predators just take off, and they all would take off for the water. I mean, that was where food sources, or where the safety lay was in the water. Not just food was near the water, it's also where safety was. If you take a grizzly or so, they will go for cover. A polar bear will always head for water. And during that time, what I found was, I found one island with fireweed, and I would see always from the air, when we flew over, we would see polar bears at the point. And so we decided to go camping there, and had a few juveniles hanging around. And there was a big bird colony. Bears didn't show any interest in the birds. Like, this is an Arctic tern attacking a polar bear. And then we had a big storm. And after the storm was gone, it broke our tent. And we hadn't seen a bear for 5-6 days. But when the storm lifted, we saw a bear go by our tent about 70, 80 yards away. And he would go about 100 yards beyond us and then turn around and would drop behind a little rock ridge where we couldn't see him, and he wouldn't reappear. And then we started to walk over there, and what we found was a washed up beluga. And what we then had was, like, it got me exceedingly nervous. I was used with grizzlies. You have like a food source like that, you would have a lot of grizzlies showing up, but they would all fight. And then it would be one happy grizzly and a lot of unhappy grizzlies. And I expected to see one happy polar bear and a lot of unhappy polar bears. And we were camping a few yards away. And we had within 2 days, 27 polar bears. And it was like a party. We didn't have an aggressive animal at all, except for this guy. And he actually thought that where we were was where the food was, and he would charge me, and I had to charge him back. And in all these 20 years, this is the only really aggressive polar bear I've ever had, and I had hundreds of encounters. So a lot of what they're eating on and that was scavenging. So there is belugas, there's marine mammals getting washed up. And what we later on then also watched was, and again, this is not something that only developed because it got warmer. It just nobody ever observed it. We then in that area, because we saw dead belugas, we saw a lot of skulls on shore, was wondering like how come so many dead belugas were in that area. And it turned out that actually the polar bears, and there was a little river coming in, and the belugas would go right into the river mouth, and there were polar bears lying on rocks, jumping on the backs of belugas. There's no other areas we found where polar bears actually fish for Arctic char. We have filmed them feeding berries. So all the things that we were told originally that bears don't do, it turned out they were doing. And if there is a food source, they will utilize it. They will go, like we've watched them then later on in the fall, pursue moose. And so this is not really to say anything like then they play a lot. As soon as there is food around, they play a lot. And this is then an image of a juvenile that didn't get anything off the beluga because he didn't dare to go close enough. And this then ended up that I got a contract to film in the Arctic polar bear summer, and we would get a boat in there, which then turned out to be, I mean, boating in Hudson Bay, as you can see. This is how the whole coastline looks like. It's really hard to get there on shore. Mm-hmm. And we would watch the bears feed. We would sows and cubs interact. So there's a lot of scavenging. There is some beluga hunting. There is basically no seal hunting because the seal stay out on the open ocean. They don't really come to land. There's quite a bit of berry feeding, and depending on local resources, you get also then going after bird eggs, bird nests. And all of this really has only become reasonably public knowledge in the last 10 years. Before, the assumption was they don't really do anything. They just wait for it to get cold again.
Wow, this is
some just some here. Falling.
I do want to let our YouTube viewers know that if they do have to go at 2:30, that this recording will be live, so you can come back and finish it up. But I think we should move on to question and answers because we have so many questions. I have so many questions for you. Is there anything else you want to say before we ask a couple questions?
No, I just have some other images from further up north, where meanwhile I've been working with polar bears trying to determine what they would feed there. Southern Hudson Bay has more food sources on land. And there too, I mean, when I then spent time like on Ellesmere Island, northern Baffin Island, we found polar bears doing the same thing. They would hunt belugas in the summer. There's just specific locations when they can. We saw one polar bear pulling a narwhal on shore in the summer on Baffin Island. They go after berries. So the thing that you have to understand is that food sources in the summer are not big enough for support a large mammal like that. So they depend on the sea ice. So as sea ice goes down, it certainly overall polar bear population will suffer. Right now, I just can just skip well, it's tough to skip ahead of the application, but you often get conflicting information. You get information that polar bears are doing just fine, that numbers are increasing, and so the whole global warming issue is not really a problem for them. They can adapt. That's a little bit like saying an elephant is becoming a giraffe because the climate changes. I mean, that's not happening. Polar bears are sea ice hunters. It doesn't mean they eat only something they get on the sea ice. It means that is their primary food source. If the sea ice is gone, we don't have polar bears anymore. And part of the reason that we haven't seen numbers decline overall is that, well, to some degree, we simply don't know how many there are there. We don't really have accurate numbers for a lot of areas. And the other reason is that, well, marine mammal numbers generally, because whaling has mostly stopped, and also bear hunting has stopped mostly. So there is a certain recovery in populations despite it getting warmer. But like I've been last year all over the high Arctic, and it was hot everywhere. And so if it continues the way it is at the moment warming, I would say most polar bears in 30 years are in severe trouble. There will be still areas that will support reasonably good population, but Hudson Bay, I would say in 30 years, you probably don't have recruitment anymore. You may still have polar bears, but probably no recruitment, meaning that the young don't survive. The adults still survive, they find enough food, but the cubs don't make it. And that's when the numbers very quickly drop off. So.
Wow. Well, thank you. That was definitely one of our questions. You know, what is the biggest threats to polar bears? And it sounds like climate change and melting ice are really going to impact the habitats and the food source for polar bears. Is there anything that we can do as a society or that kids can do to polar bear?
Well, so there is multiple threats. One is obviously the global warming. Then what can we do individually about global warming? That has been addressed in so many aspects. There's certainly things we can do, just conservation issues, but none of it is very direct. Other issues that impact the polar bears very much is really an increased use of the Arctic resource use. And this is shipping lanes. This is also mineral exploration, oil exploration, all kinds of these kind of resource exploration. And basically all over the Arctic, the only way these mines, oil drilling, gas production can work is by being supplied via ships. And that has, as a rule, the result of going directly through prime polar bear habitat, and that's even the Northwest Passage route and stuff like that. And I think just being aware that all these resource exploration and exploitation can have a severe impact, and if it comes up in elections, in campaigns, that is something that has very direct impact very quickly. Like if a mine gets developed in a certain area, that may wipe out the local polar bear population. And to say no to these kind of development matters. And if you have like buy stuff in stores, if there is that it is produced ecologically sound, it matters. The fishing industry goes into the Arctic, and it's also matters like where does the fish come from, how is it managed. A lot of it is basically how politicians manage resources and whether we can have an impact on it. And I think we can. We can through voting, we can through just expressing our opinions that there should be space for polar bears in the Arctic.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. So before I get to the next question, do you mind share screen so that we can see you in full view?
Okay. No
I'm going to ask another great question. This one is I have the exact same question as he does. So the question is, how do you get close enough to take photos of polar bears? Those were amazing photos. Thank you so much for sharing them. How on earth did you get that close to be able to take them?
Well, there's two parts. Obviously, you go to the area where polar bears live. And then the next thing is really working with them. And very often you can't just show up and take a picture. I mean, often there's quite a bit of time involved. And to get personal images basically requires that the animal is trusting you. It's an animal that is not trusting you is in all likelihood will move off, and you don't always get the picture of the south end of a northbound bear. So it is just being on the ground, working on foot, staying there for a while, and knowing how you can work on foot safely, which as a rule requires that you have someone with you that knows what he's doing. And actually, I have a few thing that people always ask me, well, how do I protect myself? Well, the most important things I have to protect myself are actually these two things. This here is a bear banger. Creates a loud noise. And I had to use it once when a polar bear tried to climb through our window in the cabin. And well, bear took off, so it worked. And this here is a flare, and that's probably the most useful tool. When it's a pull flare, so when you pull this string, it shoots out a flame about this long and then keeps on smoking and hissing for 7 minutes. And I mean, hissing is an aggressive action in polar bears. I've never had a bear even trying to go through that. But in all my life, I used either one of them once. And like we usually have a shotgun along, but I've never had to use any of that. So it's a lot is how you interact with the bear, recognizing which one is aggressive, which one isn't. A lot of time curiosity is mistaken for aggression, and how you control interaction. And your dad and a friend of ours, George Karunis, did a film on that where I just showed George how you can walk with bears. And theoretically it's simple, but you have to really know what you're doing and stay dominant. And then you can get these kind of images. Through a vehicle, you just don't get it. The bears don't act normally. You just don't get these personal interactions.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So I think you have probably the coolest job in the world. You are a wildlife photographer and a biologist. So the next question is, what advice do you have for kids if they want to become a wildlife photographer or a biologist or both?
I get asked this very often, how do you become a wildlife biologist? Or how do you become a bear biologist, bear photographer, wildlife photographer? I mean, biologist is easy, you go to university and take the courses, but how do you work then in the field? And I mean, you select the university that actually works in the field, on field projects. And there are universities like in Canada, University of Alberta has Arctic programs, University of Manitoba has Arctic programs. And in the US, there's also some that go into these areas. To become a wildlife photographer, basically everyone, so I work as a photographer also for National Geographic, and every single photographer that works natural history for National Geographic has some special connection to the topic they're working on. So it's basically nobody just simply takes some nice animal pictures. They have a connection to the particular animal they work with, or the group of animal they work with. Like you look at Steve Winter, it's always like Panthera, he works a lot with the big cats. I work with mostly bears. You get a little bit pigeonholed, but my advantage that I can get images others cannot get is the knowledge of the bear. And so anyone who wants to go into wildlife photography, what you need is you need a special connection to your topic. Just taking pretty images, there's a lot of people taking pretty images. So you have to have that special angle that sets you apart.
That's great. And where can we see more of your photos or more of your work?
Well, there's TV shows I've done for Smithsonian, like Polar Bear Summer, Angry Planet, that was walking with polar bears. I've done 20 books. Not all of them are still in print, but you just Google me and it comes up. There's like right now I'm just finishing off a new grizzly book. I'm working on a new polar bear project in the Arctic. So there's, yeah, I like doing books, so I enjoy that, just telling the whole story. But just Googling my name will come up with numerous images and books and projects that are going on.
Right, there's lots to explore. And now one question before we go, this is a question that we ask every participant before the end of their session. What is your next adventure?
With coronavirus, who knows exactly? Well, there's 3 projects that are ongoing. I work for the State Department actually in Mongolia right now on a Gobi bear project and a special protected area. At the moment, we can't travel there, so that has been, I was supposed to be in Mongolia right now. And then the other project I have is a big polar bear project where all over the Arctic, where we basically try to locate where polar bear hotspots are. A lot of the Arctic has hotspots where there is resources available in abundance. And then there's vast areas where there's basically nothing. And for a lot of the Arctic, we don't know where the hotspots are, which makes it really difficult to do then wildlife protection. And so at the moment, I'm working on getting funding to go all over the Canadian Arctic, Alaska Arctic, and Greenland to really cover on ground these areas and find out where are these bears really living. You get overall population numbers, but you don't actually know which part of the habitat they use extensively. And so last year we were up on Ellesmere Island and Baffin Island. We found pretty big numbers of polar bears in areas we didn't even know they would go to, and found them hunting belugas in some spots. So this will go on, and I hope within the next 3 years we'll have a reasonably good idea where the polar bears are in the high Arctic, what they do.
Well, thank you so much for dedicating your life to learning more about polar bears so we all know more about the Arctic and the threats to them. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to chat with us. We really appreciate it. And of course, thank you to everybody who is on live stream right now. Keep in mind that we have an amazing lineup of other STEM-related live streams this week. Tomorrow at the same time, 2 p.m., we'll be talking about marine robotics. So you can check out the whole week of STEM events. You won't want to miss it. And check out the complete list at home.reachtheworld.org. And thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you.